Matthew's 28th birthday banquet. Someone gifted him a woman right in front of me. I abandoned my usual gentle demeanor, smashed a wine glass, and wrecked the party scene. Then I moved out of the house with my luggage alone. Everyone said that the lonely Mrs. Liu wouldn't last more than 3 days before crawling back. Matthew didn't care at all. An orphan, where can she go after leaving the Liu family? But after countless 3-day stretches, people began to wonder if I had died somewhere. Only then did Matthew call for the first time. But he found the number was no longer in service. Later, at a famous painter's exhibition, a profile portrait left Matthew stunned. He offered an astronomical price to buy the painting. Romeo smiled apologetically. "This is the portrait I'm most satisfied with that I painted for my wife. I can't part with it." Chapter 1. It was Matthew's 28th birthday banquet. I wore the most exquisite and beautiful dress, holding onto Matthew's arm as we made our entrance together. As soon as we descended the stairs, Matthew let go of my hand and left me behind. Everyone's eyes followed him. I was left forgotten in the corner. One after another, people brought gifts for Matthew. With a calm expression, he motioned for the butler to take them, until someone presented a stunning beauty, and suddenly all eyes turned to me. Some were sympathetic, some were there for the drama, and others mocked. Over the years, I had seen far too many of these malicious gazes. For a moment, Matthew's otherwise emotionless face seemed startled. The beauty resembled his deceased first love too much. "Offering me a woman in front of Mrs. Liu, you sure have guts." Matthew chuckled sarcastically. The gift giver flattered him. "Mrs. Liu is generous. Surely she won't mind." It wasn't that I didn't mind, they just counted on me not daring to make a fuss. An orphan raised by the Liu family. How could I dare to say no to the new head of the Liu family? Matthew spun the wedding ring on his finger, a smile spreading in his eyes. "Since Mrs. Liu has agreed to take her away." Before Matthew could finish, I was already by his side, just a few steps away. I looked at the beauty standing in front of him. The gift giver had truly put thought into it, catering to Matthew's preferences. Suddenly, I felt exhausted. It seemed like I could no longer follow Grandma's advice to maintain the dignity of Mrs. Liu. With a slight push, the champagne tower behind me collapsed. The beautifully stacked crystals shattered instantly, scattering broken glass and champagne everywhere, causing chaos at the banquet. Someone gasped. "Mrs. Liu has gone mad." Chapter 2. I ruined Matthew's birthday banquet, but he didn't care much. The butler had already arranged for the guests to leave, and the mess was being cleaned up by the staff. The beautiful woman had stayed behind, quietly standing next to Matthew. Even her personality seemed strikingly similar to Matthew's first love. Compared to them, I really did seem crazy. Matthew played with the woman's fingers, glancing at me with casual indifference. "Why are you so angry? If you don't want to see her, I'll have her stay elsewhere." "Don't worry. I swore to Grandma that I would never take away your position as Mrs. Liu." The woman beside him also spoke, trying to placate me. "Mrs. Liu, why be upset? A man like Mr. Liu would never have just one woman. I admire Mr. Liu, but I won't interfere with your status." I took off the ring from my finger and placed it on the table in front of Matthew. He raised an eyebrow. "Here's your ring back." Matthew picked up the ring and tossed it into the air. The sparkling diamond traced a brilliant arc before landing back in his hand. He threw it behind him, giving it to the woman. "Here, a multi-million-dollar ring Mrs. Liu says she doesn't want." Matthew stood up, letting out a cold laugh, and ordered the butler, "Find a few teachers to teach Madam some manners. I don't want to see this kind of rudeness again." After a few steps, he turned back. He tossed his own ring onto the floor. The ring rolled a few times before stopping at my feet. "If you don't want the ring, then we'll just throw them all away." Chapter 3. Matthew left with his entourage. The roar of the car engines echoed sharply in the night. The butler sighed beside me. "Madam, why do you provoke Mr. Liu like this? You know he harbors resentment toward you." I picked up the ring at my feet and threw it into the trash. "Uncle Chen, you can go. Don't worry about me." The butler sighed again and left. I went upstairs alone, changed out of my intricate, elegant gown, and put on a simple white t-shirt. I pulled out a suitcase and began packing all the clothes from my closet that belonged to me. When other couples argue, they have to think about divorce agreements. But my connection to Matthew was so shallow that it was reduced to just a pair of wedding rings. No one could have imagined that the city's most sensational wedding of the century. The bride and groom didn't even have a marriage certificate. I still remember what Matthew said at the wedding. My household registry will only ever have Daniela's name. Vanessa, you should never have married me. But what could I do? I still married him, the man I had liked for 7 years since my teenage years. I thought that one day I could win his heart. But in the end, I became the infamous Mrs. Liu with nothing real to show for it. As I dragged my suitcase out the door, the entire villa was eerily quiet. It was just like the rainy night when Grandma brought me back. 13-year-old Matthew had stood at the top of the stairs coldly watching me. Then he turned and went to the kitchen. He brought me a cup of warm milk. Chapter 4. I booked a flight. After 6 hours of flying and 3 hours of driving, I returned to a remote town in the south. They say that as people grow older, they yearn to return to their roots. But in reality, even someone who is homeless will long for their hometown, even if no relatives remain in that hometown. I rented a small courtyard in the town. The local dialect was both familiar and strange. I had left when I was young, and had since lived in the northern city. I had already forgotten how to speak it. Fortunately, the person living in the small courtyard next to mine was also from out of town, only he had arrived earlier than me. One day, while grocery shopping, I couldn't understand the old lady's dialect, and he stepped in to help me out. And next day I made some corn pancakes to thank him for his help the day before. That's when I learned he was an artist here to gather inspiration. He looked like he had just graduated from college, full of youthful energy and passion, away from the people and matters of the northern city. In this simple environment, I suddenly remembered that I was only 25. Yet because of my time with the Liu family, I had always carried the posture of Mrs. Liu. It made me feel like I had aged before my time. I bought flowers from the street, filling the courtyard with roses. Beside the flower bed, I placed a small rocking chair. Though modest, it was everything I desired. The garden in the Liu family's mansion was filled with yellow roses that Daniela loved, and in the glass greenhouse was an expensive piano. Matthew had it specially designed for her, and no one was allowed to touch it. Grandma once wanted to pull out those roses. It caused Matthew to have a massive outburst. If the roses are gone, then there's no point in me coming back. Since then, no one ever mentioned it again. Daniela and those roses had become a forbidden zone in the Liu family. Chapter 5. In the afternoon, there was a knock on the door of my small courtyard. Romeo, dressed in a hoodie and carrying a backpack, smiled brightly when he saw me open the door. "Sis, I'm planning to hike up the mountain to paint the sunrise tomorrow. Do you want to join me for a bit of fresh air?" He pointed to the mountain not far behind us. I knew that the place was quite famous. Most tourists who came to the town were here for that mountain. I was tempted. "Don't worry, I camp often and I'm very experienced and careful." Under his enthusiastic invitation, I nodded in agreement. Romeo, as he said, was very experienced. He quickly went back to his place and returned with another bag. He carried 2 sets of camping gear by himself, along with his painting tools. I offered to help share the load, but he firmly refused. "I'm strong, carrying this much is no big deal." As we climbed the mountain, we talked about the past and the future. My past seemed uneventful. It all revolved around the Liu family and Matthew. In the end, I became nothing more than the nominal Mrs. Liu. But Romeo was different. He always had new and exciting stories to tell, and endless dreams about the future. Life is an experience. My dream now is to become a famous artist, and you have to give it a shot right. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Let me tell you a secret. I ran away from home. If you ever find the courtyard next door empty, it's probably because my family caught me and dragged me back." I laughed. Who would have thought we were both escapees? Only he still had family who would come and take him back, while if I disappeared, Matthew would probably celebrate. When we reached the mountaintop, the timing was perfect for the sunset. Golden light bathed us warmly, creating an unreal beauty. I looked down at the small town now covered in the same golden glow, peaceful and serene. Romeo was already busy setting up the tent. I asked him, "The sunset is also beautiful. Why don't you paint it? I prefer the sunrise. Every day is a new beginning full of possibilities and life." I sat on the stool Romeo had set up for me watching him work, but my mind kept replaying his words about a new beginning. Leaving the Liu family was the bravest decision I had made in years. But I was like a timid fugitive. I returned to this remote town and shrank back into that small courtyard. I had never thought about what to do next. Was I going to spend the rest of my life in that small courtyard? I was only 25 years old, with a future still full of endless possibilities. Chapter 6. Romeo finished setting up the tent and handed me some food and water. He sprawled out on the mat next to me, his hands behind his head, gazing at the newly star-filled night sky. "Sis, you should try watching the stars like this. It's a whole different experience." In the Liu family, I was always required to follow etiquette. Everything I did had to align with the image of Mrs. Liu. The phrase I heard most was, "Madam, this is something you can't do." I had never even thought of lying down and watching the stars like this. But now Romeo didn't give me time to think. He reached out and pulled me down from the stool onto the mat. "Lie down quickly," I didn't hold back anymore, and followed his lead. Lying down, the starry sky seemed so close as if I could reach out and touch it. Romeo and I lay there, staring at the vast sky, talking about everything and nothing, and in my heart, I made a decision. I needed to step out bravely. Running away was just another form of escape. I should make new friends and see the broader world until the day when, even if Matthew were standing in front of me, he would no longer matter. Chapter 7. In the second half of the night, I fell into a deep sleep. Although it was in a simple tent outdoors, I felt more at peace than ever. The next morning, half asleep, I stumbled out of the tent to find Romeo already set up with his easel, a serious look on his face. The sun slowly rose its warm rays, gently brushing every inch of skin. I gazed at the spot where the sun was rising. This was also my new beginning. "Sis, don't move," Romeo suddenly called out excitedly. I froze on the spot, only daring to glance at him out of the corner of my eye. It was clear. He was treating me as his model. When he finally finished painting, I rubbed my stiff neck. Being a model was no easy job after all. "Let me help you with that. Thanks for being my model." Romeo's hands began to massage my shoulders. He was strong. I closed my eyes in comfort, enjoying the massage. On the way down the mountain, Romeo talked about his inspiration from earlier. I had a look at the painting, and while I found it quite beautiful, I didn't really understand the deeper meaning. As soon as we returned, Romeo disappeared into his own courtyard. I turned on the TV and Matthew's face suddenly appeared on the screen, startling me into taking a step back. I was about to change the channel but stopped. I was thankful for the decision I made last night. Matthew often appeared on TV and the internet. I couldn't avoid him forever. In the interview, Matthew didn't seem much different. When asked about the recent rumors of marital problems, he remained indifferent. "My wife is just throwing a tantrum. She'll be back after a little trip." Everyone envied me, an orphan raised by the Liu family's grandmother, who eventually managed to marry Matthew. What a fortune from a previous life. But only those who lived through it knew the truth. Being ignored by everyone, resented by Matthew holding the title of Mrs. Liu but still floating rootlessly within the Liu family. Every year when the yellow roses bloomed, Matthew would have the servants cut the flowers and fill the vases in the house. And every day the piano in the glass conservatory was wiped clean by the servants. Daniela had passed away, but Matthew constantly reminded me of her presence. I heard your fight with Mrs. Liu was because of the assistant you've been keeping around lately." Matthew frowned impatiently, habitually reaching for the wedding ring on his finger. But there was nothing there. He then remembered how Vanessa had been unusually firm this time. She had returned the ring, and even had the nerve to run away. He thought back to the day when the butler called in a panic, saying that Mrs. Liu had disappeared. He came home to find her half of the wardrobe empty. Only his suits hung there lonely and untouched. She was simply using her disappearance to force him to get rid of the woman who looked like Daniela. He knew that what Vanessa cared most about were Daniela's things, let alone a woman who resembled Daniela. But so what? Grandma was gone. She had no family left. Her only reliance was on him. When she was upset as a child, she liked to hide somewhere. Back then, Grandma coddled her. But he didn't have the patience to look for her now. Once she had suffered enough, she'd realize how good life with the Liu family was, and eventually she'd return. So he told the butler, "An orphan. Where else can she go after leaving the Liu family? Nobody is allowed to go looking for her. Let me know when she comes back." Chapter 8. Under Matthew's growing impatience, the host quickly shifted the topic from personal matters to business. When discussing work, Matthew's expression seemed much more relaxed. It seemed that Mrs. Liu was someone whose mere mention would cause him to frown. I poured myself a glass of ice water and took out my computer to start writing my resume. Most of the people left in this small town were elderly. It was a great place to retire, but offered few job opportunities. If I wanted to work, I'd have to go out and explore. I kept working until dusk when I finally stretched and got up to prepare dinner. A simple 3 dishes and a soup. As I sat at the table, I suddenly wondered if Romeo next door had finished his work. When he paints does, he also forget to eat, just like Matthew often did when working. When Grandma was still alive, Matthew had suffered from stomach pain several times because of skipping meals. Afterward, whenever I had time, I would bring him food at his office. At first, his secretary wouldn't let me into his office, and I'd wait for an hour or 2 outside. Later, he seemed to get used to it and would let me interrupt his work to eat before continuing. I sighed, put on a jacket, and knocked on Romeo's courtyard door. I didn't hear any movement, so just as I was about to leave, the door suddenly opened. When Romeo saw me, his previously impatient face broke into a smile. "Sis, I was just painting you, and here you are, at the door." Romeo still had a paintbrush in one hand with paint smudges all over his clothes and even his face looking a bit of a mess. But his smile was so bright that the paint smudges only added to his charm, making him seem more vibrant. "You haven't eaten yet, have you? Want to come over for dinner?" Upon hearing my invitation, Romeo clutched his stomach and belatedly groaned in hunger. "I'm starving. You're the best, sis. Let me put this brush down." For the next few days, Romeo and I seemed to reach a silent agreement. He came over for dinner every day, and in return he helped me clean up, took care of the gardening, and even helped plant flowers and vegetables in the yard. It's a pity I don't have a younger brother. Having someone like Romeo as a brother wouldn't be bad at all. I sent out a few resumes and received some interview invitations. On the day I decided to leave, I got up early to say goodbye to Romeo. As soon as I opened the door, I saw several black sedans parked in front of Romeo's courtyard. By the cars stood several men in suits looking like bodyguards. Chapter 9. I hesitated for a few minutes before walking over. When I got close, one of the bodyguards reached out as if to stop me. "Don't touch her." Romeo came out of the courtyard, his sunny smile gone, replaced by a colder, more serious expression. He grabbed my hand and pulled me into the courtyard. The door slammed shut behind us. "Stay out." The bodyguards exchanged glances but finally said, "Understood. Sis, did you come to invite me for dinner?" Without the bodyguards around, Romeo seemed to regain his usual cheerfulness. "No, I came to say goodbye." Romeo's voice suddenly grew louder. "Where are you going?" I told him about the resumes I had sent out and the interviews I had lined up. "Though this place is great, that day on the mountain, you said every day is a new beginning, full of possibilities in life. I want to give myself a fresh start and leave no regrets. So sis, have you let go of that person in your heart? I looked at him surprised. Romeo blinked. Don't take me for a child. An artist's eyes are sharp, you know. Having him say it like that made me feel a bit embarrassed. Yes, I suppose I've let go. Where are you going to work, North City? I had thought about moving to a city farther away from Matthew, but ever since Grandma took me in, I had lived in North City. I grew up there, went to school there, and most of my friends were there. Why should I force myself to start over in a completely unfamiliar city just because of Matthew? I'll go with you, sis. My family's already here to pick me up. Chapter 10. I didn't expect to end up hitching a ride with Romeo. The tension of returning to North City and possibly facing Matthew again gradually faded as Romeo rambled on about his plans. Life in North City seemed to go smoothly. The interview went well, and I received an offer to start the following week. I even rented an apartment near the company, but after disappearing for 2 days, Romeo became my neighbor again. While taking out the trash, I saw workers moving furniture in and out of the apartment next door. A quick glance revealed Romeo tall and lanky, directing the workers on where to place everything. What are you doing here? I was going to surprise you, but you caught me. Romeo naturally bent down to take the trash bag from my hands. I missed your cooking, so I decided to be your neighbor again and mooch off your meals. I was genuinely surprised by his appearance. Living in a new place, having him as a neighbor again gave me a sense of comfort. Well, I'll cook a few dishes later to celebrate your move. For convenience, we decided to have hot pot at home. The red oil hot pot boiled, and Romeo scooped out a freshly cooked piece of tripe and placed it in my bowl. As soon as I took a bite, the spice hit me, and I couldn't help but grab a drink and gulp it down. You can't handle spicy food. I thought you loved hot pot, so I assumed. It's fine. Maybe I just haven't had it in a while, so I'm not used to it. How long had it been since I last had hot pot? I couldn't even remember. I used to love hot pot the most. When Grandma was around, she'd eat with me. She'd have the clear broth while I had the spicy one. There was a time when Matthew had worked late into the night, and the meal I brought him had gone cold. It started to snow outside, so I suggested we go out for dinner. I took him to a hot pot place. Matthew had always preferred bland flavors, so I ordered a split pot. But throughout the meal, Matthew frowned. On the way home, he said, "Don't eat that anymore. It leaves a smell all over you." After that, I never had spicy hot pot again. When you go too long without something, even your taste buds become unfamiliar with it. But soon enough, I was sweating profusely and rediscovered the joy of eating hot pot. After dinner, Romeo cleared the table, cleaned the kitchen, and opened the windows to let the air in. He took the trash out on his way home. Chapter 11. Life in North City turned out to be much calmer than I had expected. The media wasn't talking about the long-absent Mrs. Liu, and no one from the Liu family came looking for me. My existence was never worth paying attention to, but the media did seem more curious about the assistant Matthew always kept by his side. I absent-mindedly scrolled through the paparazzi photos. It was all so ironic. Did Matthew really love Daniela? That much? In the photos, Matthew bent down, letting the woman straighten his tie. When getting into the car, he carefully protected her head. On a rainy day, the woman held the umbrella high, and when Matthew took it from her, it tilted completely toward her side. So that's how easily love can transfer, just because of a similar face. Matthew had always guarded Daniela's memory carefully. No photos of her had ever leaked. Everyone was speculating whether I had been completely cast aside by Matthew. If I were still in the Liu family, I would probably be at home waiting for a husband who wouldn't return. But now I was busy sorting through plans, attending meetings. Busy with Romeo. I told you not to act all spoiled with me like that. I pushed away the head leaning against my shoulder. Romeo, however, pushed my computer farther away, grumbling in dissatisfaction. I'm such a handsome guy sitting right in front of you, and you're daydreaming about some old man. It was the first time I had heard someone call Matthew an old man. Imagining Matthew's expression if he heard that made me burst out laughing. When I finally stopped laughing and looked up, I found Romeo's expression had turned serious. "Is he the one who hurt you, Matthew, from the Lou Corporation?" "I know him." I looked at him surprised. In my memory, I had never seen Romeo at the Lou family home. When I was a kid, my mom made me call him Uncle. I couldn't hold it in again, clutching my stomach as I collapsed onto the sofa in laughter. He's only 4 years older than you, and you actually called him Uncle. Haha. Romeo pinched my face. He looks old. Matthew had been involved in the family business from a young age, making him seem more mature than his peers. I guess that made sense. "So you're the missing Mrs. Lou." Romeo's face suddenly got closer. Only then did I realize that, during all the laughing, I had somehow ended up resting my head on Romeo's lap. I tried to push him away and sit up, but this time he didn't back down like usual. He stared at me intently as if waiting for an answer. "Yes. So am I, the secret lover you're keeping on the side." Romeo cracked up at his own joke. I slapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Stop saying nonsense. And besides, I've already left the Lou family. I even gave back the ring. Then I'll hire a lawyer, and you two can get divorced tomorrow." "There's no need. We don't have a marriage certificate." I smiled bitterly. Without a marriage certificate, there was no need for a divorce. The only tie between us had been that symbolic wedding ring. Maybe I'd played the role of Mrs. Lou for so long that even Matthew had forgotten that we didn't have a legal marriage certificate. Well then, how about helping me get one chapter 12? Looking at the freshly printed marriage certificate in my hands, I felt a bit dazed. Back then, I thought the photo on my marriage certificate would feature Matthew and me. I never imagined that the groom would be someone else. Last night, after Romeo's persistent pleading, I agreed to help him with a fake marriage to appease his family. Romeo snatched the marriage certificate from my hand. "I'll take this home and show it to my family. Otherwise, my mom will still think I'm lying to her." This marriage didn't feel real at all. 3 years ago, that grand wedding had all the ceremony but no marriage certificate. Everything felt like it was done to create a false image of happiness for others to see. Now I had a marriage certificate, but no wedding. But I felt at peace. Maybe because without any expectations, there was no room for disappointment. When Romeo returned home with the certificate, he brought back some good news. "My parents have agreed to let me hold an art exhibition. I'm really proud of these pieces." Chapter 13. A month later, Romeo's art exhibition was a success. That day I had to work late, and it was already close to 8 p.m. when I left the office. As I hurried to the exhibition, I saw a figure in the crowd outside that looked a lot like Matthew's. I shook my head. Must be someone with a similar build. When I entered the gallery, I noticed that many of the paintings on display were familiar. A group of excited girls holding sketchbooks rushed past me. "Hurry, hurry, Romeo's just up ahead. We have to get his autograph this time. I heard this is his last exhibition. If we miss this chance, we might never get his signature." Following the girl's gaze, I saw Romeo towering above the crowd. He had his head bowed patiently, signing autographs for those in line. I thought this was his first exhibition. How could it be the last? I glanced around the room and finally noticed the information about Romeo posted at the entrance. It turned out he was already a well-known artist, and his previous works had been displayed nationwide, with many selling for astronomical prices. Standing there, I suddenly felt hesitant to approach him. The Romeo described in that introduction didn't seem like the same boy who used to playfully whine at me. Quietly, I slipped out of the gallery. As I stepped outside, I saw Matthew standing by the road, frowning as he talked on the phone. So I hadn't been mistaken earlier. Chapter 14. Matthew repeatedly dialed the number he had never initiated contact with before. Although he knew that all he would hear was the mechanical message telling him that Vanessa's number was no longer in service. But he realized that besides that number, he had no idea who else to contact to find her. He kept thinking about the profile he had seen at the art exhibition. There was a nagging sense of unease in his heart. He had always been most relieved by Vanessa's background. She had no family, and seemingly very few friends, with no one to rely on in this world. Only he and the Liu family could be her support. That's why he always believed that even if she wanted to, Vanessa would never truly leave the Liu family. Once, the butler called to inform him that Vanessa's number was disconnected. He had been indifferent at the time. Unless she's dead out there, she'll come back eventually. The butler had been shocked at those words. Could something really have happened to her? Sir Matthew scoffed. How could that be? If something had happened, the police would have contacted him, her so-called husband, but it had been more than 6 months now. Vanessa had never reappeared. When he saw that painting today, he felt his heart skip a beat. The person in the painting resembled Vanessa so much, but also didn't quite look like her. The woman in the painting had a light in her eyes brighter than the morning sun behind her, a brightness that was almost too dazzling to look at directly. Vanessa wasn't like that. She was more like still water, never stirring. Even mud has a temper, but Vanessa was like water, easily molded without even enough strength to utter a word in anger. When bullied, all she ever did was hide away. He once caught her crying alone beside the glass conservatory. The moment she heard his footsteps, she scurried off like a frightened kitten hiding in her room. What he had hated most about her was how unpresentable she was. She was already Mrs. Liu, but she only pretended to be proper outside. The moment she returned to the Liu family home, her true self would show. He had wanted to buy that painting, intending to hang it in Vanessa's room, so she could look at it every day and be subtly influenced by it. But Romeo had said, "This is the portrait of my wife, my most prized work. I'm sorry I can't part with it." Oddly, hearing that had made Matthew feel relieved. The woman in the painting wasn't Vanessa after all, but as soon as he left the exhibition, an inexplicable urge to contact Vanessa overwhelmed him. She had been angry for too long. Surely it was time for her to return. After the repeated mechanical responses, Matthew finally lost his patience and turned to his bodyguards. Find out where she is, and when you do, bring her back. Chapter 15. When the Liu family's bodyguards knocked. On the door, Romeo was setting the table in the dining room. As soon as the door opened, the bodyguards tried to barge in, but Romeo blocked them. "Who are you looking for?" The bodyguard's gaze fixed on me, standing with a spatula in hand. "Ma'am, Mr. Liu has ordered us to bring you back." I hadn't heard that title in so long. For a moment, it felt like a lifetime ago. "What nonsense are you talking about?" "This is my wife, Romeo." Pushed the bodyguards toward the door, and they exchanged glances. One of them pulled out a phone and dialed Matthew. "Mr. Liu, it looks like she's already married." Matthew arrived faster than I had imagined. Within minutes, he was standing at the door, his face twisted with anger. The bodyguard stepped aside, and Matthew tried to push Romeo out of the way. But Romeo didn't budge. "Pull him off," Matthew shouted at the bodyguards. "Matthew, you've barged into my home trying to take away my wife. That doesn't seem appropriate, does it?" Matthew finally turned his full attention to Romeo. "So, the woman in that painting was my wife. Seems like I'm the one who deserves an explanation here. Explanation for what we've already registered our marriage. She's my legal wife." Matthew let out a cold laugh, his gaze meeting mine from across the room. "Vanessa, you think you've grown some courage, running off and marrying someone behind my back? Come back now and I'll act like none of this ever happened." He extended a hand in my direction. In the past, whenever he extended his hand, I would take it without hesitation. But this time, I didn't move. "Matthew, I already gave you back the ring. We're done." "Done. The Liu family raised you and you think you can just say we're done and walk away, Vanessa." What the hell kind of nonsense is that? Matthew's eyes were bloodshot, and in his distraction, Romeo hadn't noticed Matthew charge forward. He grabbed my wrist so tightly that it felt like he might break it. "You're going to get a divorce from him right now. Isn't that what you wanted to marry me? Fine. After the divorce, we'll register our marriage." With my free hand, I slapped Matthew across the face. The room fell completely silent. It was as though Matthew couldn't comprehend what I had just done. "Matthew, what's wrong with you? I've already left the Liu family and I don't want that marriage certificate anymore. Now that I'm gone, take whoever you want back home. Let's just leave each other alone." "Why should I let you go? The Liu family raised you. If you're going to die, you'll die with the Liu family." Matthew suddenly scooped me up, but as soon as he reached the door, Romeo's family bodyguards who had just stepped out of the elevator blocked his path. "Mr. Liu, if you try to take her, I'll charge you with kidnapping. Don't think for a second I don't have the power to protect my own wife." I was shaken. This was a scene I had never imagined. I thought that leaving would make Matthew feel relieved. If I told him we were even, maybe he'd even be happy. But what was he doing now? Who was this display for? Before I knew it, the bodyguards from both sides had started to scuffle and chaos ensued. Romeo also ended up fighting Matthew. Luckily, Romeo won. But he had taken a punch to his left cheek from Matthew, and it looked pretty bad. "Mr. Liu, you're getting too old for this. Fighting doesn't suit you. You should stop trying to act tough." I tugged at Romeo's sleeve, worried Matthew would retaliate later. Matthew had never been in a fight, and he was a mess. Even the bodyguards had suffered some blows. "You all take him home. Don't come looking for me again." I pulled Romeo back into the apartment. He winced, holding his face. "Wife, that punch was harsh." "Do you think I'm disfigured?" I pulled out the first aid kit. "Stop calling me wife. Let me get you some medicine." As I moved closer, he suddenly turned his head and kissed me on the lips. "This is better than medicine. By the way, how come you didn't object when I called you wife?" In front of Matthew, I shoved the iodine solution into his hand. "You said it was just a formality, that we weren't actually married." Romeo grinned, looking pleased with himself. "I just wanted to make it official so the Liu family couldn't take you away. You tricked me into this marriage." "Yep, I traded going back to work at the company for my freedom to marry. If it's a trick, then I've put my whole life into it. If you divorce me now, I'll lose both a wife and have to work for the company for the rest of my life. That'd be so tragic." Now I understood why he had said this would be his last exhibition. I poked at his injured cheek. "You're such a fool." "Yup. But at least if you stay with me, I can be foolishly happy for the rest of my life." I nodded, and Romeo took it a step further. "Wife, can I officially kiss you now?" Before I could respond, his lips were already on mine. Things quickly spiraled. Out of control, and Romeo kissed me like a child, finally getting his long-awaited treat. By the time I tried to push him away, I had melted into a puddle. "Romeo, stop. Don't worry, I'll be gentle." In a daze, I finally understood what Romeo meant when he said he had great stamina. Chapter 16. Romeo moved us to a new home. He said he was worried Matthew might come to harass us again. After moving, things were quiet for a while, until Romeo took me to a bridal shop to pick out a wedding dress. I had no idea we were planning a wedding. From the day we got our marriage certificate, I started planning. When I painted that portrait of you, I knew I had to make you the most beautiful bride. Romeo handled every detail of the wedding himself. Occasionally, his mom would pull me aside to ask for my opinion on something. When we went to select the hotel, we ran into Matthew in the garden courtyard. I wanted to avoid him, but he saw me first. "Vanessa, come back. Please, I'll take care of you for the rest of my life, just like Grandma wanted. The Liu family is your home. You've lived there since you were a child. Do you really want to leave me and abandon our home too?" I pulled my hand away from his grasp. "I spent so many years in the Liu family, and you never treated me like family. Now I have a new family. Please don't bother me anymore." Romeo's parents were very fond of me, especially after learning that my parents had passed away and I had no other relatives. Romeo's mom hugged me crying, saying she would be my mother from now on. I loved the home Romeo had given me. It was a place where I truly belonged. At the Liu family home, Grandma had been my only family. But after she passed, there was nothing left for me to hold on to. When I saw Romeo coming out, I waved and ran toward him. He wrapped my coat tighter around me, and holding me close, continued discussing wedding details with the hotel manager. Matthew stood frozen in place, his eyes following me as I walked away. But I never looked back. Matthew's perspective. I always prided myself on having a keen sense of judgment in the business world. But somehow, I had never truly understood Vanessa, the person closest to me. I thought she was helpless and could be controlled however I pleased. But after she left, she suddenly found her courage. When Grandma insisted we marry, I agreed in name, only staging a wedding for her benefit. I purposely didn't register our marriage, and Vanessa endured it all without even complaining to Grandma. I would place Daniela's favorite yellow roses in front of her on purpose, watching as her face paled, finally realizing what she cared about. So when a woman who resembled Daniela appeared before me, I didn't hesitate to say yes. As expected, Vanessa's face looked worse than ever. But I didn't think she'd throw a tantrum or return the wedding ring. I always thought of her as a child running away from home. I never expected that without my noticing she had already grown up. I was no longer her only support. She had her own job, new friends, and now even a husband. I had been waiting downstairs for the bodyguards to bring her back when they called to tell me she was already married. I nearly smashed my phone. She had said we were done, like she was determined to cut ties with me forever to become strangers. In my anger, I lashed out, but I lost that fight to that annoying brat. I remembered how much I used to hate him as a kid. I was only a few years older than him, but he still called me Uncle. Now that he'd grown up, I hated him even more. But when Vanessa saw him injured, all her concern was for him. Maybe she hadn't even realized it herself, but her eyes were only on that brat. When she looked at me, all I saw was wariness. For the first time, I felt like I had lost something I could never get back. Their wedding invitation arrived in my hands, the smiles on their faces and the photo piercing me like a knife. We once had a grand wedding too, but I was so dismissive that I didn't even bother to take a photo with her. I left all the arrangements to the butler, as if I were just a guest at the event. She must have been so disappointed by that wedding. All these years I had grown used to her being by my side, taking her for granted, assuming she would always be there. It's only now that I realize some people once lost will never be mine again. She's given up on the Liu family, and I've been left behind forever, trapped in the Liu family's shadow. If you like this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like these only at StoryTimes.